3 names were printed on the shift roster the night everything changed at the Colford water treatment plant. Mine, Terry Blackwoods, and a name I had never seen before, Price Lamb. I had worked Thursday overnights with Terry for 2 years. I knew every name that had ever rotated through our shift. Price Lamb was not one of them, and when I called the plant manager to ask who he was, Phil Drennan told me, without hesitation, that Price had been on my rotation for 6 months. I need to explain the place, because the setting matters more than I understood at the time. The Colford Municipal Water Treatment Plant sits at the end of a county road about 9 miles south of Colford, Indiana. A town of roughly 11,000 people spread across the flat agricultural land between Indianapolis and Terre Haute. To reach the plant, you drive past a soybean processing operation and a decommissioned grain elevator whose corrugated walls have gone the color of rust. The plant itself handles all drinking water for Colford and 3 smaller communities that share the municipal system. 2 treatment buildings, a chemical storage structure, 4 settling basins, an operations building where the control room is. The control room is where you spend your shift. 2 monitors showing system readouts, a desk with a landline phone, a SCADA terminal for process control, a row of binders containing standard operating procedures arranged by spine color. Red for emergencies, blue for daily operations, green for maintenance, and a wide window that overlooks the settling basins. At night, the basins are lit by sodium fixtures that turn the water a flat, coppery orange. If you stare at them long enough, the color starts to feel permanent, like it's seeped into your vision and will still be there when you close your eyes. I had been a plant operator at Colford for 3 years. The job required a state certification, which I'd earned through a community college program. 6 months of chemistry, hydraulics, and regulatory compliance, followed by an exam that mostly tested whether you could read a chlorine residual chart without second-guessing yourself. The work was methodical. Daytime shifts meant monitoring chemical dosing, running water quality tests, logging turbidity readings, replacing filters, and coordinating with the maintenance crew when pumps needed attention. Overnight shifts were quieter. The plant mostly ran itself between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. You watched the SCADA readouts, did a walkthrough of the facility every 2 hours, and called the on-call supervisor if anything deviated from normal parameters. I brought a thermos of coffee, a ham sandwich in a plastic bag, and whatever book I was reading. Terry brought crossword puzzles torn from a booklet she bought at the dollar store and a steady supply of complaints about her ex-husband. We had worked together dozens of times. She was 54, had been at the plant for 11 years, and knew the treatment systems better than anyone, including the managers who rotated through every few years and spent most of their tenure learning things Terry could have told them on day 1. She was sharp and blunt and reliable. She called me kid, even though I was 31. When something went wrong with a pump or a dosing system at 3 a.m., Terry was the person you wanted next to you, because she didn't panic and she didn't guess. I trusted her the way you trust a guardrail, not something you think about until you need it, and then you realize it's the only thing between you and a very long fall. So when I saw that 3rd name on the roster, Price Lamb, printed in the same standard font as every other name, slotted between mine and Terry's as though it had always been there. I called Phil Drennan immediately. Phil answered on the 2nd ring. I told him I was looking at Thursday's shift roster and didn't recognize one of the names. Price? Phil said. He's been on your rotation since October. Is everything okay? I said I'd never worked a shift with anyone named Price. Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled through his nose. Not quite a laugh, more the sound of someone deciding to be patient. You two sit in the same control room every other Thursday. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't argue. I hung up, opened my work email and searched for the name. Nothing came up. No messages to or from Price Lamb. I logged into the internal scheduling system. There he was, Price Lamb, Level 2 operator, hired the previous April, assigned to Thursday overnight rotation starting in October. His employee photo showed a man in his mid-40s with a narrow face, close-cropped graying hair, and an expression that gave nothing away. I studied the photo for a long time. I had no memory of this face. Not in the control room, not in the hallway during shift changes, not in the parking lot. He did not exist anywhere in my recollection of the plant. I called Terry. She picked up the way she always did. What now? I asked her if she knew someone named Price Lamb. Price? Sure. Quiet guy. Sits at the third station. Clicks his pen like it owes him money. Why? I said I was confirming the roster. She told me Price had been on our shift for months and asked if I was sleeping all right. I said I was fine. I drove to the plant that Thursday evening carrying a feeling I couldn't name. Not anxiety, something more architectural, like discovering a load-bearing wall in your house that you'd never noticed, and realizing the house you thought you knew has a different structure than the one you've been living in. I arrived at 10:40 p.m. 2 cars were in the lot, Terry's maroon Civic, which I recognized the way you recognize a piece of furniture in your own home, and a silver pickup truck I had never seen. The outgoing day shift operator, Craig, briefed me at the control room desk. Normal parameters across the board. Basin 3 was running slightly high on turbidity, but within acceptable range. Chemical delivery was scheduled for Monday. Craig left. I set up my thermos and settled into my station. Terry was already at Station 1, crossword book open, pen behind her ear. And at Station 3, a desk I had always understood to be unoccupied, a surface where I sometimes stacked my procedure binders during long shifts, a man was sitting, narrow face, close-cropped hair. Blue work polo with the Colford Municipal logo stitched above the pocket. He was reading something on the SCADA terminal and making notes on a clipboard, the pen moving in small, precise strokes. He looked up when I sat down and gave me a brief nod, the economical acknowledgement of someone who has seen you many times and doesn't need to perform friendliness. Then he went back to his screen. He was real. The chair held his weight. The pen scraped against the clipboard with the friction of a real object against a real surface. When he shifted in his seat, the chair creaked the way the control room chairs always creaked. A particular squeak from the hydraulic cylinder that maintenance had never gotten around to fixing. The room smelled the way it always smelled. Recycled vac air. The faint chemical sharpness that drifted in from the treatment process. Terry's coconut hand lotion. Price Lamb was physically present in the control room, and according to every person and every record I could access, he had been for half a year. I got through the shift by refusing to think about it. I did my walkthroughs every 2 hours. Operations building, corridor, chemical storage, settling basins, back to control. I checked chlorine residuals and logged turbidity readings and verified that the SCADA system was reporting accurately. Price spoke twice during the shift. Once to flag a minor pressure fluctuation in the distribution line, and once to ask Terry if there was more coffee in the break room. His voice was unremarkable, flat Midwestern cadence, the kind of voice you'd forget 5 seconds after hearing it. He moved through the plant during his own walkthroughs with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew where every valve and gauge was located. At 7 a.m., the day shift arrived. I walked to the parking lot. Price was already there, climbing into the silver pickup. He raised a hand as he backed out of the space. I raised mine, automatically, the way you do when the gesture is expected, regardless of whether you mean it. I went home. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I kept reheating in the microwave and tried to build a rational explanation. The possibilities were these. I had some form of targeted amnesia that had selectively erased 6 months of interactions with a specific coworker. Unlikely but not impossible. I'd read about dissociative conditions that could isolate categories of memory. Or the scheduling records were wrong and everyone's recollections were mistaken, and Price had been added more recently than they believed. Also unlikely since Terry was not a person who misremembered things. Or the simplest option. I was overtired and confused and making a problem out of nothing. I told myself it was the third option. I ate dinner. I slept poorly. I moved through my week. The following Thursday, I checked the roster before leaving for the plant. 3 names. Mine, Terry Blackwood, Price Lamb. Consistent. I arrived at 10:40, Terry at Station 1, Price at Station 3. The shift was unremarkable. I did my walkthroughs, logged my readings, drank my coffee, read 40 pages of a paperback I'd been working through for weeks. Price was quiet. Terry filled in crossword clues and told me about a plumbing issue at her house. Normal. At 3:15 a.m., during my second walkthrough, I passed through the chemical storage building. It was a cinder block structure connected to the main operations building by a short covered corridor that always smelled faintly of wet concrete, regardless of the weather. Inside, the air was cold and carried the sharp, almost sweet bite of stored sodium hypochlorite. Chemical drums were stacked on pallets along with walls. Their labels faded from the overhead lights. Industrial fixtures with wire cages that buzzed at a low, persistent frequency you could feel in your back teeth if the room was quiet enough. Next to the door, mounted at eye level, was the shift safety board. A whiteboard with a printed template and dry erase fields for shift personnel, emergency contacts and hazard notes. Terry filled it in at the beginning of every shift. She was meticulous about emergency preparedness. The kind of person who believed that if the board wasn't current, it was your fault when something went wrong. I glanced at it as I walked past. Then I stopped and looked again. The shift personnel section listed 2 names, mine and Terry Blackwood. Both in Terry's careful block handwriting. Price Lamb was not on the board. I stood in the chemical storage building under those buzzing lights and read the board 3 times. 2 names, not 3. Terry had filled this in 4 hours ago, at the start of the shift, and she had written 2 names. She had sat across from Price in the control room, spoken to him, heard him ask about the coffee, and then walked to this building and written 2 names on the safety board, as though 2 people were all there were. I went back to the control room. Price was at his station, entering data. Terry was reading. I sat down and waited a few minutes before speaking. Terry, you filled out the safety board in chemical storage tonight? She looked up from her crossword. Always do. Why? How many names did you write? She frowned. 3. You, me, and Price. Did I misspell something? No, I said. Just checking. During my 5 a.m. walkthrough, I returned to chemical storage. The safety board now listed 3 names. Mine, Terry Blackwood, and Price Lamb. All in Terry's handwriting. The same pen color. The same careful block letters. The spacing was even across all 3 names. As though the board had always held 3 entries and the 2-name version I'd seen 2 hours earlier had never existed. I hadn't seen Terry leave the control room between 3:15 and 5. After that shift, I began paying closer attention, not to Price, who continued to be solid and present and utterly unremarkable, but to the paper trail, the physical records, every document that tracked who was in the building and when. Over the next 4 shifts, I found discrepancies I could not explain. The sign-in log at the front entrance, a paper binder where each employee wrote their name and arrival time, flickered between versions. Some pages listed 3 names for my Thursday overnights. Others for the same dates listed 2. Neither version looked altered. No erasure marks, no correction fluid, no differences in pen pressure. The log existed in 2 states, and I was catching it mid-transition. I started photographing every document I could reach. The roster, the sign-in binder, the safety boards, the shift reports. I time-stamped every photo and stored them in a folder on my phone named with a string of numbers. When I reviewed the photos later, the evidence was undeniable. A photo of the sign-in binder taken at 11 p.m. showed 3 names. A photo of the same page, same coffee stain, same binding crease, taken at 3 a.m. showed 2. The records were rewriting themselves between observations. I should have taken this to Phil. But I had already called him once about price and been met with careful patience, the kind that precedes an HR referral. In a municipal water treatment plant, where you hold a state certification and are responsible for the chemical safety of 11,000 people's drinking water, being labeled unstable doesn't end with a conversation. It ends with a quiet reassignment, a performance review, and a separation agreement. So I kept documenting and I said nothing. The next Thursday I checked the roster. 3 names for the overnight: mine, Price Lamb, and someone called Noreen Fitch. Terry Blackwood was not listed. I called Terry's cell phone. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail, her voice, her brisk greeting. I didn't leave a message, I called Phil. Phil, I'm looking at tonight's roster and Terry's not on it. There's a name I don't recognize. Noreen Fitch. Phil sighed. Noreen's been on your rotation for 2 years. And I don't know who Terry Blackwood is. That name's not in our system. I held the phone and felt something structural give way. Not a collapse, but the slow recognition that a wall you've leaned against every day is not attached to the floor. Phil, I said. Terry Blackwood, 54 years old. 11 years at the plant. Station 1. She does the safety boards. She brings crossword puzzles. I don't know who you're describing. Do you need someone to cover tonight? I said no. I hung up. I drove to the plant. I walked into the control room. Price was at Station 3. At Station 1, Terry's station, a woman I had never seen was arranging her belongings. Early 60s, heavy-set reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, white coffee mug with a faded church fundraiser logo. She looked up when I entered. Running a little behind tonight, Hon. Hon, the same word. The same blend of warmth and mild reproach. I sat at my station and existed inside the revision for 8 hours. After the shift, I sat in my car and called Terry's number. Disconnected. Not voicemail, the flat automated message saying the number was no longer in service. I searched for her on social media. Nothing. I drove to her house, the ranch house on the east side of Colford, where she'd told me about the stray cat on her porch. A man named Engstrom answered the door and told me he'd owned the home for 8 years. He'd never heard of Terry Blackwood. I searched my text messages. The conversations were still there. Shift swap requests, complaints about Phil, a photo of a gray tabby sitting on a concrete porch step. The messages existed on my phone, but the number they were attached to led nowhere, and when I showed the thread to a friend, he read them, shrugged, and said, "Who's Terry?" The replacement was not confined to the plant. It had reached into phone networks, property records, and the memories of everyone who should have known her. The edit was total, and I was the only one who could see the tracked changes. I began keeping a separate record, a physical notebook, college-ruled, spiral-bound, bought from a gas station. I kept it in the glove compartment of my car and never brought it inside the plant. After every shift, sitting in the parking lot with the engine running for heat, I wrote down everything. Names, descriptions, specific details. Noreen's church mug, the reading glasses, her granddaughter's name. Price's silver pickup, the pen clicking, his way of leaving 2 minutes early. I wrote these things because the memories of people the facility removed were already beginning to thin. Terry was fading, not disappearing, but flattening, the way a photograph degrades when it's been photocopied too many times. Still recognizable, but losing the grain of lived experience. The notebook held the line. Each rereading reinforced the details against whatever slow erosion the facility was performing inside my recall. Without it, I knew I would have accepted every new roster the way Phil did, without question, without memory of what had been there before. For 3 weeks, the roster held steady. Me, Price, Noreen. Then, on a Thursday in late January, Price Lamb was gone. In his place, Daniel Rusk. 25, goatee, Colford Water Department cap. He was eating a granola bar when I walked in. "Hey," he said without looking up. Comfortable, familiar. Phil confirmed Daniel had been there for months. Phil had no record of Price Lamb. The pattern was unmistakable now. I wrote Price's details in the notebook immediately. His face, his truck, his flat voice, and felt the specifics resist my pen as though they were already being pulled away from me, a current running under the surface of my memory. The moment that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening, the night before my next shift. My phone rang. A woman's voice, slightly breathless, asked if I worked at the Colford water treatment plant. "My husband works there," she said. "Daniel Rusk. He was supposed to be home from a shift yesterday morning. He's not answering his phone. I called the plant and nobody picks up." I told her I'd look into it. She said his name one more time and hung up. I called Phil. "Phil, someone just called me looking for Daniel Rusk. Says he's her husband and he didn't come home." Silence. Then, "Who's Daniel Rusk?" The floor dropped. "Your Thursday rotation is you, Noreen Fitch, and a woman named Marta Ellison," Phil said. "I don't have a Daniel Rusk. Never have." Marta Ellison. Another new name. Daniel was already gone from the system, and someone I'd never met had filled his station. I called the wife back an hour later. The number was disconnected. Daniel's wife had existed long enough to make one phone call. Then the edit closed around her too. The facility didn't leave loose ends. When it removed a person, it removed the life around them, the spouse, the phone number, the address, the history, everything. Except there was a window, a brief gap between the decision to remove and the completion of the removal. Daniel's wife had reached me inside that window, still existing, still searching. And then the window shut and she was gone, and Daniel Rusk was a name in my notebook that no one else would ever recognize. I showed up for the next shift. Noreen at Station 1. A woman I'd never seen at Station 3. Late 40s, dark hair in a practical bun, a thermos that looked like it had survived a decade of overnight shifts. She glanced up. "You're late," she said. "Marta? Every Thursday." The replacements accelerated after that. Names rotated through the stations faster than before. Noreen was pulled from Station 1 and replaced by a young woman named Gin Hadley. Short dark hair, serious expression, spoke only when the job required it. Then Gin was pulled and replaced by someone else. Then that person was pulled. Owen Treat with his hunting magazines. Suki Danforth listening to podcasts through one earbud. Alan Voss cracking his knuckles before every walkthrough. Some lasted weeks, some lasted days. Every time the pattern held. A new name on the roster. An old name erased from records, from Phil's memory, from the world. The control room rearranging itself around the absence like water closing over a stone. And every Thursday night, Marta and I sat in the middle of it, with our notebooks hidden in our cars, pretending we still belonged there. Because Marta noticed too. She told me during a quiet stretch around 2 a.m., weeks after she'd first appeared at Station 3. Gin was on a walkthrough. The SCADA system hummed. The basins glowed copper through the window. Marta was looking at her thermos, turning it slowly in her hands. Without raising her eyes, she said very quietly, "How many names do you have in the notebook?" I didn't move. My pen was in my hand, under the desk. She was 10 feet away. She shouldn't have been able to see it. "I keep one too," she said, "in my car. I've been keeping it for longer than you." The silence between us was different from the plant's usual nighttime quiet. It was loaded. Two people on opposite sides of a shared secret, deciding whether to step into the open. "How many?" I asked. 23, she said. "Since I started counting. Different names, different faces. Same 2 stations cycling, and us in the middle every time. How long have you been noticing?" 3 years. She finally looked at me. Her expression was not frightened. It was the face of someone who had been carrying a weight for a long time, and had learned the exact posture required to bear it without breaking. "The facility cycles people through these shifts," she said. "Creates them, places them here, lets them work for a few weeks, then removes them and starts over with a new version. But it keeps 2 of us constant, real people, anchors." "Anchors for what?" "Commerson. The people it assigns, they look real. They have homes, histories, families. But they're constructed. The facility builds them and tests them against us. It watches how they interact with real people, whether we notice anything off, whether the seams show. We're quality control. I wanted to reject this. The rational part of me, the part that had spent 3 years logging turbidity data and trusting that the world operated on verifiable principles, wanted to tell her she was wrong. But I had watched people materialize and vanish. I had seen records rewrite themselves. I had called phone numbers that stopped existing mid-conversation. Marta's explanation was the only framework that fit the data. "I've seen them before they're finished," she added. Standing in parts of the plant where nobody goes during overnight shifts, facing walls, not moving, like something that's been assembled but hasn't been switched on yet. 3 shifts later, I saw one myself. It was 3:20 a.m. Chemical storage. I was walking toward the chlorine feed system when I saw him standing between 2 rows of chemical drums, facing the far wall. Blue work polo with the Colford logo. Average build, arms at his sides. Completely still. Not the stillness of someone standing quietly, but the stillness of something that has no reason to move, because no instruction to move has been given. "Hey," I said, "you're not authorized to be in here." He turned around. The face was technically complete, all the features in the correct proportions, but it was assembled without the asymmetries and accidents that make a face belong to a specific person. His eyes were open and pointed at me, but they processed nothing. Looking into his face was like looking into a window that had been painted to resemble a face from the outside but had nothing behind it. He held my gaze for 5 seconds. Then he turned back to the wall. I left. I walked back to the control room at a controlled pace, each step deliberate, because the part of me that wanted to run was the part I couldn't afford to listen to. Running would mean I had lost the ability to manage what was happening, and I had seen what happened to people the facility decided it no longer needed. Marta glanced at me when I sat down. I nodded once. She nodded back. That exchange, 2 small movements of the head across a fluorescent-lit control room at 3:30 in the morning, was the closest thing to safety I had felt in months. The weeks that followed established a pattern between us. We compared notes during walkthroughs, verified each other's counts, confirmed that our notebooks matched. That mutual verification mattered more than I can express, because the facility's edits weren't limited to paperwork and other people's recall. They reached into my own memory, slowly but persistently, like water finding cracks in concrete. Terry was now a list of attributes in my notebook. Price had become an outline. Daniel was a name I had to reread to connect to anything at all. The notebook held the line, but each rereading felt a little more like studying someone else's notes and a little less like remembering. Then the small, impossible things began. The first was on a Thursday in late March. I walked into the control room at the start of my shift and glanced at Station 1, where the current occupant, a man named Alan Voss, had left his things. His reading glasses were on the desk. His knuckle-cracking habit had left faint marks on the laminate surface. Everything was normal. But tucked under the edge of his keyboard, barely visible, was a torn piece of newsprint. I pulled it out. It was a crossword puzzle, partially filled in. The handwriting was Terry's, her careful block letters, the way she wrote her capital E with an extra-long middle bar. Terry had been gone for 5 months. Alan Voss did not do crossword puzzles. He had never done crossword puzzles. The torn page was from a dollar store booklet, the exact brand Terry used. I put it in my pocket and said nothing. The second was the smell. During a 3 a.m. walkthrough the following week, I entered the corridor between the operations building and chemical storage and was hit by a wave of coconut. Terry's hand lotion, the specific brand. I recognized the sweetness of it, the slightly artificial tropical note that I'd smelled hundreds of times across 2 years of shared shifts. It was strong, concentrated, as though someone had just applied it. The corridor was empty. The smell lasted about 10 seconds, then faded, replaced by the usual damp concrete. The third was the voice. I was alone in the control room. Marta was on her walkthrough. The current Station 1 occupant was in the break room when the intercom system clicked on. The plant's intercom was old, rarely used, prone to static. It clicked on, emitted a brief hiss, and then, very faintly under the white noise, a voice said, "Kid." One word, Terry's voice, Terry's inflection. The exact way she said it when she meant, "Pay attention." The intercom clicked off. I sat at my station and stared at the speaker mounted on the wall above the door. The plastic housing was yellowed with age. A small red indicator light glowed steadily, then went dark. I told Marta about the crossword page, the lotion smell, the intercom. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "She's still in the building." "What do you mean, in the building?" "The facility pulls people from the roster. It removes them from records, from memory, from the outside world. But it doesn't pull them out of here. Not completely. They stay in the structure, in the walls, the wiring, the pipes. The building absorbed them during all the years they worked here, and when the facility deletes them from the system, the part of them that's soaked into the concrete doesn't go. You've seen this before? Not with someone I knew as well as you knew, Terry. But yes, traces. Small things that don't belong to anyone currently on the roster. The building remembers people the system has erased. On a Thursday in April, warm enough that the parking lot smelled like heated asphalt and chemical storage had lost its usual chill, I arrived for my shift and checked the roster. 3 names. Marta Ellison, Alan Voss, mine, and a 4th, handwritten in pencil in the margin, beside the printed names in small neat letters, Terry Blackwood. I stared at it. The printed roster held 3 names as usual. But someone, or something, had written Terry's name outside the formatted fields, as though it had been added after the document was generated. The pencil marks were faint. The handwriting was not mine and not Marta's. I showed Marta. She stood in front of the roster for a long time. "I haven't seen a deleted name come back," she said. "Not in 3 years." "So what is this?" She touched the pencil marks with her fingertip lightly, as though they might smudge. "Maybe it's not the facility that wrote it." That night, during my 3 a.m. walkthrough, I went to chemical storage. The safety board listed 3 names, mine, Marta, Alan. I logged it and turned to leave. Then I looked at the far wall, the cinder block wall, where I'd seen the blank figure weeks earlier. Someone was there. Not a blank figure this time. A woman, facing the wall, but her posture was different from the unfinished constructs. She stood the way a person stands when they're thinking. Weight slightly shifted. One hand touching the wall, head tilted as though listening to something on the other side. She was wearing a green field jacket slightly too large with a frayed cuff on the left sleeve. Terry had worn that jacket every winter night, draped over the back of her chair, put on for walkthroughs because the corridors were cold and she ran cold herself. "Terry?" I said. She turned around. It was her face. Not a composite, not an approximation, her face. The lines around her eyes, the mole on her left jaw, the way her mouth set when she was thinking. She looked at me the way she had looked at me 100 times, direct, assessing, slightly impatient. "Hey, kid," she said. My throat closed, not from fear, from something worse. The sudden, violent return of every detail the facility had spent 5 months eroding from my mind. Her voice hit me like recovered memory, and for a moment I couldn't speak because I was too busy remembering what it felt like to know her. "You're not supposed to be here," I managed. "Neither are you," she said. "Not for much longer." "What does that mean?" She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face. Pity. The specific pity of someone who knows something they wish they didn't. "The facility is finishing a new version," she said. "For your station. It's been building it for a while. You've seen the drafts in storage. Those are for Station 1 or Station 3. They've never replaced me. They haven't needed to. You were the control variable, the original. But the facility's been learning from you for 3 years. How you walk, How you talk, how you fill out shift reports, and drink your coffee and read your paperback and worry about things you can't fix. It has enough data now. The caged lights buzzed. A chemical drum settled on its palate with a hollow metallic sound. "And you," I said, "what are you?" "I'm a draft that didn't get deleted. The facility pulled me from the roster and wiped me from everything outside this building. But it didn't pull me out of here." She touched the cinder block wall. "I'm in the structure now, same as the ones you've seen standing in corners. Except I've been in here long enough to remember who I was." "Are you real?" "I was. That counts for something." She paused. "The crossword puzzles were real. The coffee was real. The cat on my porch was real. I just don't have a porch anymore. What do I do?" She looked at me with the expression she reserved for malfunctioning equipment at 4 a.m. The look that said the situation was bad and sentiment wasn't going to help. "Keep the notebook. Write everything down. Not for yourself, for whoever comes after. The facility can erase records and it can erode memory, but it can't erase what's been written by hand out the building. Not completely. Not yet. Why not for myself? Because writing about yourself is preservation. And the facility won't allow you to preserve yourself against the replacement. Write about them, every person who sits at those stations, every name, every detail, because when they get pulled, that notebook is the only proof they were here." She turned back to the wall. "Terry," she stopped. 11 years, I said, sitting at that station, doing crosswords, filling out the safety boards. All of that? Was that you or was that the facility?" She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, tired in a way that went past the body. "It was me," she said. "All of it. The facility didn't build me. It hired me. I was a real person who applied for a real job and sat in that chair for 11 years. And then one Thursday I showed up and someone else was sitting there and nobody knew my name." She walked into the wall the way a person walks through a doorway, naturally, without effort. One step and the cinder block accepted her, and she was gone. I touched the wall. Cold concrete. Solid. I finished my shift. I did not tell Marta what I'd seen. Not yet. I needed to think. In the parking lot, I opened the notebook and wrote everything. Terry's return. Her jacket. What she said about the facility building a replacement for me. Then I turned to a blank page and did what she told me to do. I wrote about Alan Voss, his reading glasses, his knuckle cracking, his quiet concentration. I wrote about Marta, her thermos, her tea, her 3 years of counting. I wrote about every person who had occupied a station in that control room and been erased, not for me, for them. The notebook is not a survival tool. It's an obituary book for people who were never allowed to die properly, just removed, edited, overwritten. The notebook says, you were here. You had a name and a thermos and a habit and a face, and someone saw you before you disappeared. I told Marta the following shift. About Terry. About the replacement being built for my station. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened. Still, focused, the thermos turning slowly in her hands. When I finished, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me. I wrote this a week ago, she said, in case. I opened it in my car after she'd driven away. 2 paragraphs in her careful handwriting. The first described me, my thermos, my paperback, my station, my tendency to check the chlorine residuals twice because I didn't trust the first reading. The second described herself, her tea, her bun, her age, the way she always arrived first and left last. At the bottom, in case the notebook isn't enough for either of us, carry this somewhere the building can't reach. I folded it and put it in my wallet between my driver's license and a gas station receipt. 2 descriptions of 2 people who still exist, stored outside the facility, held against the moment when the roster changes and our names are replaced by someone new who has always been there. I am still on the roster. The plant is running, the water is clean, the basins are full. The settling process continues every hour of every day, doing what it was designed to do. taking in what is turbid and disordered and processing it until what comes out the other side is smooth and consistent and safe to consume. 11,000 people drink the water this plant produces. I try not to think about what else the facility might be distributing. Last Thursday, the printed roster listed 3 names. Mine, Marta Ellison, Gil Phelan, but in the bottom margin, written lightly in pencil beside Station 2, there was another name. Mine again. Not printed, handwritten. The letters careful, measured, and perfectly legible. The handwriting of someone who had practiced my name until they could produce it without hesitation. Like the building was rehearsing.